So in the last part, we talked through what historical materialism is, and kind of developed a bit of like a worldview, an ideology, kind of a framework from which to approach Capital, volumes 1 through 3, which I think is important. And now, and the main reason I think that it's important is because what I would like to do, I think the only way to properly read Capital, whether you want to agree with it or not, is to kind of play the same game that Marx is playing and see it and kind of understand what it is that Marx is trying to do with the book. And so economics, right, as we know, is kind of a form of intellectual labor in which we reflect on the mode of production, is how I kind of defined it. But now we understand that class plays a part in this, because your entire perception of the world and your entire consciousness is connected to class. And so where you are within the mode of production is going to influence what you take away from it. In other words, we can understand now that economic theory is never neutral. Whoever does the economic thinking is going to have their perception of the mode of production distorted by their class. And so this is why different classes have their own internal ideologies. I mean, the ruling class does intellectual labor among itself and comes to conclusions which are expressions of their class interests. If you are an academic and you live a nice, comfortable life in academia, then your views are not likely to be very radical. They're not likely to, the conclusions that you come to about the world, about what should change about the mode of production, aren't probably going to be anything that would, I don't know, endanger your position because you're comfortable. And so that's, I think, a really important thing to understand. Is that economic theory can't be neutral because economic theories come to conclusions. They come to decisions about what should be done. And as long as an economic theory is meant to come to conclusions about what should be done, those conclusions are always going to boil down to, we should devolve power to this particular class. They just always do. They'll say this and that, they'll point at various math, they'll point at numbers and so forth. But at the end of the day, the conclusion is this group should have more power and this group should have less power. You can say it in a variety of ways. You can develop a whole vocabulary for expressing your class interests. But at the end of the day, your economic take is going to be, unless you're very aware of it, an expression of your own class interests. Now, this dynamic tends to put the lower classes at actually a severe disadvantage, and that's for two reasons. The first reason is that who is doing the intellectual labor? It's usually the case that the manual labor is done by the lower classes and the intellectual labor is done by the upper classes, or at least the middle classes. And if that's the case, then there aren't a lot of lower class people coming up with, doing economics, if any, right? And so the lower class economic theory is going to tend to go a little underdeveloped. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that the lower classes don't have political power. And if the upper classes have the political power, they control what Althusser would call the ideological state apparatus. They control the ability to impose their ideology down on the rest of the population. Who owns the television stations? Who owns the newspapers? Who owns the dialogue, right? Who has the control over that stuff is going to have a unique ability to project their class interests and suppress everyone else's. And so for those two reasons, you tend to, this is one of the reasons that a lot of the times the proletariat accidentally expresses somebody else's class interests, or maybe even most of the time expresses somebody else's class interests. A lot of the time, people mistake middle class expressions, petty bourgeois expressions of their class interest, stuff like, modern monetary theory and stuff. They mistake that as their own class interest because it does sound good. It's significantly better for them than the neoliberal line of thinking. They only think that because they don't sufficiently have their own theory developed, and they don't have a way to receive it. And so now we can kind of get to an idea of what Marx is really trying to do in Capital volumes 1 through 3. And all of Marx's work in general. What Marx is trying to do is he's trying to theoretically arm the proletariat. He's trying to give them a vocabulary by which they can express their class interests. And that vocabulary should include an economic analysis of capitalism, which comes to conclusions that involve basically saying the proletariat should seize power. And so that's the game that Marx is playing, and I think it's important to recognize that before you start to form your own understanding of the works, because you need to understand that that's the game Marx is playing, regardless of whether you want to come to the same conclusions as him. If you're going to propose any solutions to Marx and say this is what Marx really wanted to do, or something like that, you had better be playing the same game as him. You had better be trying to make sure at every point that your economics, that your suggestions on how to fix the problems with capital, and there are problems with capital, volumes 1 through 3, there are issues. Your proposed solutions to those issues had better not defang the book. You better kind of be trying to make sure that you're coming to conclusions that benefit the proletariat, that give the proletariat a justification for a seizure of power, essentially. Now, to some people, this might kind of be alarming in terms of its implications about the nature of truth, which I'm not really going to get into. But I think it does beg the question at this point: if economic theories are just expressions of the class interests of people, and everybody thinks that they're thinking objectively, and everybody's trying to actually get to the truth, but they're just ending up expressing their class interest, then who's right? Who's correct? And so here's my take on this. My take on this is basically that if you are anybody in the world, anybody participating in the mode of production, regardless of where you're doing it from, and you make an observation in good faith, that observation is going to be valid for you. It's going to be locally valid given what's around you. That's important thing number one. It'll be distorted by where you are in it, and it'll be as distorted as anybody else's views. So the amount of distortion is the same, and it's also kind of a local observation usually. And with those two things in mind, let's kind of lay out what we have here. We have a situation where we have class society, and in class society you have these discrete kind of classes, and each class has their own view of the world, their own theory which approximates the world. And let's assume that they're all equally developed, right? Let's assume there's been the same amount of people thinking the same amount about each one. So we have these kind of multiple theories about the world. Each one approximates the world. Each one kind of has the same amount of distortion associated with it based on the class. So which one is correct? I think there's an objective answer here. The objective answer is that, of course, the one that is most correct, the one that approximates the world the best, is the one that represents the interests of the biggest class, right? The biggest slice of the population. Maybe it makes more sense to go the other way. I can tell you which one is the least accurate, and that's going to be the theory which expresses the interests of like 1% of the population, right? Take the billionaire class. Their kind of economic theory that they love right now is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is ridiculous. The ideas it has are ridiculous most of the time. They're just insane. They're flimsy as hell. The kind of philosophical foundations are just nonsense. I mean, okay, I'm giving my opinions here, but you see what I mean. I think that there's going to be the most distortion in the economic theory that represents the smallest class, and the least distortion in the theory that represents the biggest class, just by kind of virtue of sheer democracy. In other words, I think that in any given class society, the most accurate theory is the one that represents the biggest class, like population-wise, the biggest. That's true for capitalism and any other class, in any other system. That's my own take, and that's why I value Marxism above the other ones. I've made that decision sort of as an academic, that I think I think that is the economic framework that I want to go with, and that's the reason for it. But in any case, I think now we're finally ready to really get into the actual argument of the 3 volumes of Capital. So let's do that. So the immediate question we are confronted with is, where do you even start? And Marx had a lot of trouble figuring out where to start. But I think that it's actually probably clear to us today that the appropriate place to start is these 2 concepts right here, commodities and money. Why is that? Because they are the most distinguishing features of capitalism, and also the most kind of mystifying and alien. A lot of people seem to think that commodities exist in every mode of production, and they kind of do, but they aren't, like, most things aren't typically viewed as commodities. In capitalism, everything is a commodity, as we know, including ideas and information, everything, right? but we have this vast system of kind of hieroglyphics that kind of are associated implicitly with every single object around you. Think about how weird that is. Anything you look at around you right now has a number attached to it. And that number, you call it price and you know how to work with it. But, I think that, a good place to start, at least, in an analysis of capitalism, is a discussion of what are these hieroglyphics? What do they mean? What do they actually, how do they get there and what are they? It's hard to distance yourself appropriately from the world that you're in to respect how insane it is. But I think Ian Wright has an interesting quote here that makes it very clear how kind of crazy it is that you can just look around and see that literally everything around you, including your ideas, has a number associated with it that allows you to equate anything to anything else. Only dedicated occultists would dare claim that everything we see around us, all the things and activities in the world are, despite all appearances, really the same. That 1 kilogram of caviar is the same as 1,000 different people clicking on the same internet advertisement, or that clowning at a children's party is actually the same as 200 rounds of shotgun ammunition, or that 1 month of computing time on a high-spec machine is in the cloud is the same as 1 ton of potatoes. Only highly trained adepts could begin to see the truth of such counterintuitive and magical affinities. This is Ian Wright, by the way. I'm not sure if I said that. But we more than see the truth of it. We openly and regularly achieve it. We manifest these magical affinities on a daily basis. We treat quantities of fish eggs, human attention, clowning performances, bullets, computing time, potatoes, and a bewildering array of other things as the same, because in the marketplace they are all may be exchanged for one another via the alien mediator we call money. That term alien mediator is a term that actually Marx uses in somewhere, and there's another dimension of this that makes it even weirder that Ian Wright here is getting at, which is, I can look at something and see that it has a price, and I understand that has to be some kind of social agreement. Humanity had to agree to make that the number that's associated with it. It's changing, but at any moment, it's humanity's decision to trade things the way that we trade them. And yet, the prices present themselves to us as if that's not the case. The prices of things kind of confront us, right? I can, no matter what I put into making something, once I've made it, it has a price, and that price kind of confronts me as something alien, something that is the opposite of something that it seems like we all agreed on. People treat the market like it's some kind of god. People talk about the market behaving as if it's doing things independently of people, that it's steering us rather than us steering it. And so we're going to keep talking about this, but this is kind of what Marx called commodity fetishism, where we've kind of imbued the commodity itself with some kind of agency that has been alienated away from ourselves and made to seem objective. And it's a very we'll keep talking about this as much as we can as we go, but in any case, we know our starting point now. If we're going to make sense of capitalism, we should probably start by trying to understand these numbers that are attached to everything. So what we need is a theory of value. What is value and where does it come from? That's kind of implicitly the same question as what is money? Like, what are these prices actually a reflection of? And so you're told something about this in high school, of course. You're told the story that it basically is a function of supply and demand. We have various ways of measuring how many of something there are and how much people want the thing. And that the price of the thing is basically some kind of compromise between those two things. If the demand is high but the supply is low, the price will be high. If the supply is high but the price is low, but the demand is low, then the prices will be low. And you're basically told that that's the end of it to some extent. But there's immediately a problem with this. And the problem with this is that what if supply and demand are the same? What, is the value just 0 at that point, or is the value some 1 maybe or something? What do I decide it is? And let me ask you this, right? Consider a plane versus a pencil. If the supply and demand are the same for a plane and supply and demand are the same for a pencil, shouldn't the plane be still have a higher price than the pencil? So there's a hole there. There's something missing in that conception of what price is. Another thing to ask about a theory of price in which everything is left to supply and demand, that I kind of want to leave somewhat to your own decision, is to ask the question, as you should always ask with any economic question, who benefits? Who benefits from a theory of price that is like this? Who's empowered and who's disempowered? And I would argue that a theory like this, which reduces everything down to supply and demand in terms of price, is very much in the interests of the capitalist class at the expense of the workers' class, at least in terms of empowerment. I also would say that this tends to alienate both parties. This tends to actually aid in the fetishism of price. But in any case, I do think that it disempowers labor more than it does capital. If this is the case, then the people who control the circulation of things are the ones that have control over what the prices of things are. In other words, if the worker who works in production produces a thing, it's not going to do anything about the price. The production of things has no effect on price in a theory like this. And you might argue that, well, okay, supply is certainly dictated by the capitalist, so that in some sense empowers the capitalist to have a say in prices. But don't workers also have a say in terms of demand? There's a lot, I think, and this is, I think, one of the great misconceptions of our current historical moment is the idea that consumers can, in some sense, influence the world through their choice of consumption. And this is a big misconception, in my opinion. It can be somewhat valid for non-essential goods like video games and media, but in terms of the essential things, the things that our society tells you are essential, this couldn't be further from the truth. You do not, let me put it to you this way. As many people as they want can decide to not drive a car, but that's not going to affect the fact that we live in a society that usually requires everybody to buy cars. You can find a way around it, but that's not going to affect the car industry very much because our cities were specifically designed to require people to get cars, right? It's the same thing with a phone. I can choose to abstain from getting a modern smartphone. I can get some other kind of phone, but that's not really going to change the societal norm of having a phone. The capitalist class, the producing class, or the class that decides on production, that commands production, has, I would say, about 90% of the say in creating demand. The capitalist class definitely, for the most part, creates demand, and the consumer class has only a marginal say in demand through their consumption. I think that's a very important thing to kind of understand about our current society, is that you're not going to change it very much through your consumption habits. And so if you accept that, then I think you have to accept that supply and demand as a theory of price disempowers labor and, if anything, empowers capital. So moving on, what we need then is we want a theory of price that does the opposite. We want a theory of price that empowers labor and does not disempower labor. And so obviously what that means is that we want a theory of price where the labor that goes into something is going to have a say in the price. And this is true already. Let me ask you this. Here's a scenario for you. And I think that this happened to me as a kid, and you probably have your own version of it. Suppose you're in a grocery store with your mom. You're like 7 or 8 years old or something, and you're looking around at all these hieroglyphics on all the stuff all around you. You're looking at the tomatoes and things like that, and you're seeing all the numbers, and you notice something peculiar. You see a watermelon, and you see that it's just a full melon, and it's like $2 maybe. And then you look to your right, and you see the area where you have a bunch of pre-chopped up things, right? And you see a chopped up watermelon. It's the same thing. Let's say the same amount for simplicity, but it's not $2, is it? The chopped up watermelon is like $3 or $4, isn't it? And so you'll ask yourself naturally, why is that? Why is the chopped up watermelon more expensive than the regular watermelon? And the answer will immediately come to you. Everybody, the question resolves itself as immediately as the asking of it. The answer is, of course, it's more because somebody went to the trouble for you of cutting it up for you. They put extra labor into it. The chopped up watermelon costs more because it takes more labor to create. There was more labor put into the product than was put into just the watermelon on its own. They chopped it up, and that's why it's more expensive. So everybody already knows on some level that labor has a say in price, that the things that take more labor create a higher price than the things that take less labor. Now, the more skeptical among you might be kind of scoffing at this and being like, okay, sure, fine, whatever. If things take more labor, then that's a resource, and there's more resource, so it should be more expensive. But shouldn't this apply to all resources? Like, what about oil? Right? It took some amount of oil to make the watermelon, which sounds odd, but it's true. The watermelon had to be transported. You needed some kind of tractor and some kind of machinery to produce it, by the modern standards and stuff. Oil went into that watermelon as a resource, and it should be by the same logic. Something that takes more oil should also increase the price. So why is labor special here? Well, one thing that you should immediately notice is that the oil also requires labor. So you might say, okay, what about the oil? So you can kind of take this idea and just kind of like reduce everything down to labor if you want to, and that's kind of what this famous quote by Marx is saying here is that economy of time to this, all economy ultimately reduces itself. You can take all the other raw materials and you can break them down in terms of labor too, and you can come up with like a total resource requirement of the thing, which is entirely expressed in terms of labor. Because I think you'll agree, well, okay, maybe it's not the case that everything requires labor. But you can do that. But then you might be scoffing again and saying, oh, well, you could just do that with oil too. You could break everything down in terms of oil, which is a little bit more dubious of a claim because I don't think oil goes into everything that is done. But nonetheless, I think it's also missing the point, because what are we studying? Remember, what is the point of all this? We're coming up with an economic theory. What is economic theory about? It's about studying the mode of production. It's about studying the human mode of organization. What are we doing each day? We're spending our time making things. Labor time is very closely related to what we're doing in a significant and fundamental way that is different than other commodities. We should care about labor more than the other stuff. Even the extent to which the labor theory of value is replaceable by other theories of value involving other commodities, that's missing the point and alienating ourselves away from our own product. I think that to some extent, at least in terms of like a scientific mathematical breakdown, you have to view labor as like no different from the other commodities. But we all know that that's not the case. Because what we're doing as humans is we are the ones spending our time making things. Think about it this way. I'm in I'm in like what Adam Smith would call like an early and rude state of society or something like that, where, everybody's got, the same stuff. I tell you, I'm going to go out hunting for the day, and you say, cool, I'm going to be weaving today. And then I go spend the day hunting, and you spend the day weaving, and then we come back and we share that product with each other. How do we divvy it up? We each give ourselves a day's worth of the product, right? We're going to do it that way. That's just what's going to happen. So in early societies, it makes no sense just by kind of what an economy is. It makes no sense to assume anything other than labor is like what Adam Smith would call the first price. In fact, let me just go to this quote. Here's a very powerful quote by Adam Smith to this regard. Labor was the first price, the original purchase, money that was paid for all things. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all wealth of the world was originally purchased. You can actually show this mathematically to some extent. There are models that show that you can use dynamic models where you basically assume that everybody has access to the same means of production. Everybody can make whatever they want and as much of it as they want by standard methods, and then they can bring their stuff to market and then trade around with each other. You can show that in any model like that, you're actually going to get an approach towards the labor theory of value. You're going to approach a state of society in which the prices of things, however people are measuring price, whatever people are using is kind of like a universal, like a money type thing, that they're always going to be, that those prices are always going to end up approaching an amount of time. In other words, like $1 in that society is going to end up equaling essentially like 1 hour or 2 or 30 minutes or something like that. In other words, money in like a naive labor theory of value, which is what I'm describing. I'm going to call this the naive labor theory of value. Money is simply a unit of time. In other words, $1 represents like alpha hours of labor for some alpha. And so if the price of a commodity is $5, then it takes 5 alpha total hours to create the commodity. That's what the $5 price tag, that's what the hieroglyphic tells you, basically, is that it takes that many hours. The dollar corresponds to some number of hours so that you could look at the number of dollars and immediately think about the number of hours that it took to make something. That there's a direct correspondence multiplicatively between those two things. I'm going to make that more clear on the next slide, and I'm going to come back to this when I talk about this last point. But what we're really saying is not so much time is money. Everybody knows time is money, and we talked about why time is money. The watermelon example tells us why time is money. If it takes time to do something, they're going to up the price, right? That time is money. However, what we're saying is something stronger. We're saying that money is time. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to summarize what we're going to look at as like a first pass of the labor theory of value. It's what Marx does in volume 1 and 2. He's doing like basically a simplification for the sake of the argument. And so what I'm going to call this is the naive labor theory of value. Later on, it's going to get a little more complicated, but it's not going to deviate too much from this, that the arguments that we're going to make involving this don't apply anymore. So the naive labor theory of value says the following. It says that the equilibrium price of any commodity is proportional, and so it can be basically thought of as equal, to the amount of socially necessary labor time embodied in the commodity. So there's a lot going on there. First of all, we want to make it clear that we are not rejecting supply and demand as a driver for price. What we're really saying is that when supply and demand are equal, that commodities are going to have prices which are proportional to the values. And then as supply and demand change, that price will orbit around that equilibrium price. In other words, the natural price, as Adam Smith or Ricardo or something would call it, is the labor time. And the market price is a deviation from the natural price as a result of supply and demand. But when we say, and I'll talk about what social necessity means in a second, but embodied does not simply mean the amount of labor that goes into making the thing from the raw materials. It actually is going to include the labor that goes into the raw materials. So let's say that I have just think about a bunch of Legos, right? Just to make it really simple. Right, I put the Legos together. It takes some amount of time, and I come up with a product. And that amount of time is the living labor that I put into it. Time I take to actually build the product from the component pieces, right? But those component pieces also took labor to be put in front of me. That's the dead labor. We're going to call that amount C. So in other words, there's value associated with the raw materials. And by the way, I'm going to refer to value as labor time. When I refer to value, I'm really talking about time from here on. Value in the Marxist kind of terminology means labor time. So what I'm trying to say is that I'll do another example of this in a second. In the next slide, I'll talk about a BLT sandwich. I use this example because the ingredients are right there in the name. If I'm going to make a BLT sandwich, let's say it takes 15 minutes to do it. If I have the bread and the lettuce and the tomatoes and the bacon. If those are all in front of me, it takes some amount of time to put them together. But there's also time that went into the ingredients, and I want to include that in too. So that's where labor time is different than value. And so I have basically the time required to produce the materials, that's the dead labor, and we're generally going to call this amount C. And then we have the time required to use the materials to actually make the thing, the living labor, and we're going to call this L. And I generally use the notation lambda to denote the value, the Greek letter lambda. And so we have basically that the price of a commodity can be, or the value of a commodity can be written with this equation. Lambda equals C plus L. L is the time it took me to make the sandwich, and then C is the time it took me to get those the time it took someone else to get those materials in front of me. And so the value is not just the labor time, it's the total labor time embodied in the product, including every step that it took to get in front of me. So I'm going to measure value in hours, in this presentation. I'm actually not always going to measure it in hours. We'll do something different in a little bit. But the commodity also has a price. So we have values and we also have prices. And so we can actually kind of convert directly from lambda to P, right? We can say the same thing. We can say that the price of a commodity is the price of the wages that I had to kind of pay somebody to make it for me, plus the price of the raw materials. So you can kind of write a similar thing down for price that you can for value, where C sub P is the cost of the raw materials in dollars, and L sub P is the wages paid to workers. Yeah. So basically, the naive labor theory of value, to put it into math, is to say that P equals A lambda, or alpha lambda for some alpha. I guess I use A now. It's a bit of a mistake, but yeah. In other words, price is some amount of hours, right? Whatever the value is, A times that is the price. There's some A that I can just multiply by to go from P to lambda and go back from lambda. And there's, I can of course multiply by 1 over that to go from lambda to P. So let's do an example to make this clear. I know this looks like a lot, but we're going to go over it carefully. So suppose it takes, on average, 15 minutes to assemble a BLT sandwich, given the sliced bread, the lettuce, and the tomatoes, and the bacon strips. So this is the living labor component. If it takes 15 minutes to make a sandwich, and I'm measuring it in hours, then the living labor component is 1/4, right? 1/4 of an hour, 15 minutes. And so you can see at the end, right down here, just to skip a little bit, I have lambda s, the value of the sandwich, is equal to C plus L, where L is the 1/4 that I wrote right here. So let's say that one BLT takes on average 1/20th of a head of lettuce. And these are just complete numbers. These are numbers I pulled out of my ass. I just made them up. 1/8 of a pound of bacon, 1/5 of a loaf of bread, and 1/3 of a tomato. So these are the amounts of each raw material, right? There's a unit associated with a head of lettuce, right? One head of lettuce is how I'm measuring lettuce, and I need 1/20th of that to make the sandwich, and so forth. So suppose we already have that the value of a head of lettuce is lambda L, and that's half an hour. And that might sound kind of weird, but like, I mean, just keep in mind that like one single harvest of lettuce, which is kind of when you make lettuce as like a farmer, you're making a lot of lettuce at once. And so one head of lettuce is actually a very, very small amount of the total crop. And so if you're kind of distributing the labor time to every single different head of lettuce, then it's going to be very small. So that's kind of why I think half an hour isn't really that off, you know. And the value of a pound of bacon is lambda b, and we're going to say that's an hour and a half. And that the value of a loaf of bread is lambda g, which is 2/3 of an hour. And that the value of a tomato is lambda t, which is 1/6 of an hour. Again, these are just numbers I made up. But we have the value, let's just say we have these values already. Then the total value of the raw materials for the BLC sandwich, this is the C component, the dead labor, is going to be 1/20th lambda sub L. That's one because we need 1/20th of a head of lettuce, and so you take that and you multiply it by this. You know, 1/8, we need 1/8 of a pound of bacon, so that's the 1/8 here, so you multiply it by the value of bacon. 1/5 of a loaf of bread, multiply that by the value of the grain. I said lambda g. And then 1/3 of a tomato, so you multiply that by lambda t, and then you plug those things in, you plug in those lambdas that are already given, and you get 2/5 of an hour. That's the value of the raw materials. And then finally, we can calculate the value of the sandwich by saying that the value of the sandwich is C plus L, which is 2/5 plus 1/4, which is 13/20, which amounts to 0.65 hours. So that's the value of a sandwich. It's not 15 minutes, it's whatever this is in minutes. And if $1 is equivalent to 20 minutes, then we have this determines the value. But if we assume the naive labor theory of value, then we also get a theory of price out of this. Keep in mind, you can calculate values without any thinking about prices at all. Values kind of exist, and we'll talk about the extent that they actually exist later. But like, you don't need to know anything about price to calculate these values. But if we are assuming the naive labor theory of value, then this gives us a theory of price. We can say, okay, let's say if $1 is equivalent to 20 minutes, that is 1/3 of an hour, then 1 hour is worth $3. And so the sandwich would be worth 3 times this, right? 0.65 times 3, so $1.95. So this would tell me that if supply and demand are in equilibrium, the naive labor theory of value tells me that the sandwich is worth $1.95. So that's kind of the naive labor theory of value as a theory of price. We should really be careful to specify some nuances and some caveats, though. So firstly, I kind of overlooked or kind of purposefully ignored one little detail about this, which is that when I say it takes on average 15 minutes to assemble a BLT sandwich, what I'm really saying there is that by the standard methods of production that society employs, it is only necessary to spend 15 minutes to make the sandwich. So what I mean by that is that, like, if I spend 6 hours making a BLT sandwich and it takes an average person an average of 15 minutes to put the thing together, then that doesn't change the value of the sandwich. Values are determined by the average labor required and not the actual labor done to make the thing. So, I can take an absurdly long time to make something, but when I'm talking about values, I'm talking about like a societally determined thing. The standard methods of production and the standard way that people go about making things determines the values. It's not the actual moment that you make the thing. To put it a little differently, let's kind of think about this in the context of capitalism. In capitalism, values are much more coherent than other modes of production. And the reason for that is something we're going to talk about, the coercive laws of competition. Basically, if I'm a capitalist and I want to get into some industry, I'm not going to invent my own methods of production. What are you going to do? Well, you need to be competitive. And so what you have to do is you have to employ the methods of production that everybody else is employing, or do better, right? You're not going to use some outdated mode to make the thing, or you're going to go out of business. You have to sit on the cutting edge. And so you can say in some sense that these are more than just statistics, right? If there are kind of, within capitalism specifically, there are standard methods of production, and there are kind of standard numbers associated with everything, right? There's a standard amount of oil that it takes to make a computer monitor. And there's also, and by that exact same logic, there's a standard amount of labor that goes into the computer monitor that is in some sense more than just an average amount of labor. It's something that says something about the technological state of society. So these values are a lot more, they are averages, they're statistics in some sense, but they're also very real, especially in capitalism in some sense too. They're statistics, but they're kind of more than that as well. They're kind of like a kind of coefficients of technology, you could say. And that's what I mean by the 15 minutes. Hopefully that makes sense. That might have been kind of confusing. Secondly, I've already said this, but it bears repeating. Prices will fluctuate according to supply and demand, but they'll be fluctuating around their values. So if demand is high and supply is low, the price will be higher than the value. And if supply is higher than demand, then it will be lower. Values, again, it should be emphasized, are equilibrium prices. There's a lot of vulgar criticism of the labor theory of value saying, well, we ignore supply and demand. No, we don't. We just think that is besides the point. We're just kind of focusing on something else about it. What if supply and demand are in equilibrium? We're focusing on that. Third, we should talk about the idea of social necessity. I've already sort of talked about it. In terms of, there's kind of two ways to think about social necessity, in my opinion. One is the way I've already talked about, right? When I talk about socially necessary labor time, I'm saying, like, what are those standard methods of production in society, right? The time and resource use determined by that. But in order to kind of even get to that point, we also have to talk about what does it take for a commodity to even kind of plug itself into the industry that way, right? So my answer would be that a commodity becomes socially necessary when it's enough of a staple of society that it's kind of produced every day for mass consumption in predictable amounts. When it's kind of a staple of production in society. It's only those products that we kind of view as commodities to which the labor theory of value applies. And an example I have of this is, like, when Atari and Nintendo started making video games, they kind of charged prices all over the place. The labor theory of value, I don't think, should be assumed to apply to video games at the beginning of their creation, because they're not really an industry yet. They're kind of a weird thing that people are making. It's only after video games become an industry that they become socially necessary. That's one kind of critical component of what social necessity means. Social necessity doesn't mean just like what we need to survive. It's what society determines as necessary to be making every day. And in that sense, the video game industry is very much a socially necessary industry, in the sense that it kind of is plugged into the system. It's only at that point, I think, that you can expect the labor theory of value to apply, that you can expect prices to stabilize in some way and orbit their values according to supply and demand. And then this last point, are we really talking about averages? This is the point I already made, but maybe I should make it again. In capitalism specifically, there are always standard methods of production, which most, if not all, capitalists seek to emulate. So they're averages, but they're also kind of more than averages, because they're in some sense, another sense, stable and constant. Not really constant, they're going to be changing, right? People are going to be innovating, and we'll talk about that. But constant in the sense that if I go from one capitalist to another, they're going to be kind of the same numbers. This is true also for all commodities except for one. There's one exception to this rule about there being like a standard method of production. And that commodity is labor power. So let's talk about labor power. So most people think about capitalism as they go and they find a job. They don't necessarily see themselves as selling a product, but they are. They are selling a commodity. They're selling the only commodity that they have to sell, which is their own labor. And that is a commodity, and that's what I'm calling labor power. Labor power is the commodity that is a day's work from a worker. And when I talk about a day's work from a worker, I'm talking about like the day's work from like an average worker with average skills. There are versions we can improve the labor theory of value later by adding on conditions to make it to talk about like different types of skilled labor. There's ways to do that, but for simplicity, we're just going to assume that workers kind of have like a homogeneous set of skills. And we have like an average worker, and that's all that's available on the market for the capitalist to buy. Let's just say that. That'll simplify the discussion of labor power as a single commodity, as opposed to an array of commodities, which is what it is in real life. But let's just assume it's a single commodity, because that'll keep things simple. And what I do mean as the commodity labor power is I really am referring to a day's work. Now, how many hours are in a day is kind of determined by society. And it tends to be a societal constant, right? The whole country decides on like an 8-hour workday or a 10-hour workday or whatever. Although, obviously, that tends to change more fluidly. But let's just assume again for simplicity that there is a common amount of the day's work. There's like a fixed. Let's assume that there's a fixed number of hours that people work every day, right? There is a daily a number of hours that a day's work corresponds to. And that's what the capitalist has to buy. Now, of course, again, in real life, capitalists buy, contract workers for like a year, or sometimes for, pay them by the week or whatever. We're going to assume that this is a daily thing. Every day, the worker goes back into the market and sells their labor again. And again, that's just kind of a simplification for simplicity's sake. It's not really a weakness of the model so much, I don't think. So that's what I mean by labor power as a commodity, a day's work that you purchase from a worker on the market. And now we need to ask a very interesting question, which is, what is the labor value of that? What is the value of that? What is the day's wage? Because that's really what the value of labor power is. It's going to correspond to the daily wage. And so the answer is, like any other commodity, the total labor time, the value of labor power is the total labor time required to produce it. It's how much work, how many hours of work are needed each day to produce that worker on the market. And so if I'm a worker, what this means is that, so think about it this way, there's a bundle of commodities that the worker consumes each day. Every day, you need food, you need a certain amount of shelter, you need clothing, and so forth. And there's a bundle of commodities you can think of that the worker needs in order to exist every day, to continue to exist one more day. And we're going to call that the means of subsistence. That's an important word to remember. The means of subsistence is the bundle of commodities necessary to reproduce the worker to sell his own labor power each day. And it's a more complicated bundle than just the immediate goods that we need, because we want to produce, we need to talk about all of the costs of production of the worker. The worker has a certain fitness level, right? The worker has a certain level of muscle atrophy. The worker has a certain educational level. The worker has to be able to reproduce other workers too, and that has to go into the cost too, right? The worker has to be able to support a family, to have worker kids to send to work. Otherwise, you're going to run out of workers eventually. Remember, the mode of production has to reproduce itself, so the worker has to reproduce. Capitalism is very bad at this, but let's assume it's good at this. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt. And in that case, you need to not only kind of factor in the daily wage for the worker himself, but you also need to factor in a wage to support the family, to send the kids to school, to educate them, to deliver a pregnancy. There's a very complicated bundle of commodities here. If the worker is expected to get sick, like let's say 10 times throughout their life, then there's a certain amount of average costs associated with that sickness. And so the daily wage has to include whatever portion of that cost will pay itself off over the course of their life. So if the worker works like an average of 12,000 days in their life, and there's like a 6-hour, pregnancy that, 6 hours of work needs to be done to deliver that worker's 1 or 2 kids at some point, then 6 over 12,000 needs to be added to the labor value of labor power every day. If the worker needs to live in a home that has to be built, that's going to take 200 hours total to build, and they can live in that one house their whole life, then you've got to take that 200 hours and divide it by 12,000 to get that amount. And that factors into the means of subsistence as well. So this bundle of commodities could include partial products. But we can still think of it as basically there is a bundle of commodities that the worker consumes every single day that they need to consume to survive. And that bundle of commodities has a value, and that value is the value of labor power. The value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence. And the means of subsistence is the bundle of commodities that are necessary for the worker to consume in order to have what they need to show themselves up on the market the next day and have a unit of labor power to offer to the capitalist. Now that's an interesting way to think about this stuff, but it's also a very powerful way to think about this stuff, and it's also the correct way to think about this stuff in the context of the labor theory of value. It's the only way to do it. This is the only way to think about it. But already we can see that labor power as a commodity is a very special commodity, and we're only going to see that more clearly as we go. So now we finally have finished creating sort of a way to decipher all these numbers. We now have a theory of prices, and we wanted such a thing that empowered labor. Remember, we mentioned that that was sort of a political goal to some extent, and we sort of justified that in more natural ways as we went. We kind of found reasons why it's kind of more than a political goal, but the only thing to pick. But beyond that, I think that you can say that we've done that in the following sense, which is that, you know, you could argue that a labor theory of value that there is no labor theory of value that empowers labor, in the sense that the laborer doesn't have much control over what they're doing or you know, how they're doing it, right? There are standard methods of production. The worker sort of has to do things a certain way. So it's not like they control prices very much. But what this does, what having a labor theory of value does, and being able to talk about economics and the system that you're in terms of a labor theory of value, is you've now centralized the discussion around labor. The conversation is no longer about goods and commodities flying around. The conversation is about you and me. The conversation is about the labor, the work being done by society. And I think that's super important, not even just for a political reason to empower labor, but we have very much like, with the labor theory of value, you can very much humanize your economics a little bit. Economics has, in some sense, you know, with the kind of neoliberal way to think about things, been flipped on its head. Again, to kind of remind you, you tend to think about the economy as like a bunch of goods flying around with numbers attached. But with a labor theory of value, we've at least taken a step towards getting away from that. And we've taken a step towards thinking about our system in terms of people working, right? The conversation is now about the people doing the work and producing the stuff. It's no longer about the goods, it's about the labor. And I think that's very important. Now, I think that's probably a good place to stop the discussion of the labor theory of value. In the next video, we're going to start to kind of aggregate stuff together and talk about like societal dynamics. In particular, we're going to talk about the falling rate of profit. But in order to kind of preview that, what I'm going to start to think about, we've been thinking about labor power as like a unit of labor power, like a single person selling their labor. But we can think about it kind of on a more societal level too. We can say, like, in aggregate, the labor value of the entire working population as a whole, we can talk about that too. We have this whole working population, you know, maybe you know, 200 million people, right? Maybe that's your working population. And that whole total working population consumes an aggregate means of subsistence. There's a giant bundle of commodities that the working population has to consume each day. And so a portion of every single day, maybe like the first 5 hours or something, has to be spent creating that bundle before anybody can like begin to think about, I don't know, profiting. That's kind of a necessary cost of reproduction for the capitalist system. And so we're going to start to kind of think in terms of like amounts of time that the whole society has to work in order to kind of roll over to the next day. That's kind of where we're going with this. But in the meantime, I think that's probably a good place to stop. So in the next video, we'll talk about the falling rate of profit.